All right, welcome. So we are Synapse National. We're a student-run organization with 22 chapters across the country. The purpose of our chapter at the University of Oregon is to serve and support our local Eugene-Springfield area brain injury survivors. We do this by providing opportunities for socialization, by hosting a bi-monthly peer support group, by advocating for brain injury awareness, and allocating resources for brain injury survivors. Our goal for these web panels and lectures is to educate our community about brain injury and the tremendous efforts being made by folks with brain injury and professionals to bridge the gaps within our healthcare systems in order to better support survivors. If you're at all interested in joining our group or supporting us or even just keeping up with what we're doing, you can follow us on the University of Oregon's Engage website. We're also on Instagram and Facebook. And if you registered for this event, the email that sent you a reservation reminder is a great way to get in touch with us. So before we begin, I think it's important to understand the gravity of the impact that brain injury has on our national and global community. Globally, approximately 69 million individuals are thought to have sustained a traumatic brain injury each year. In North America, 1,299 people of every 100,000 has a traumatic brain injury. That's the largest proportion per 100,000 people in the entire world. To put things into perspective, these numbers were from a meta-analysis conducted in 2018. And according to the International Agency for Research on Cancer, in 2018, there were 17 million reported cases of cancer. While the mortality rates of cancer are arguably higher, 158 to every 100,000 compared to 30 in every 100,000, traumatic brain injury leaves a devastating impact on disability-adjusted life years and the individual outcomes of its survivors. So today we will be discussing resilience. This human concept is considered to be a critical characteristic of recovery, both from injury and from trauma. However, I'd like to emphasize a thought to consider before we dive into this topic. Brain injury is often a lifelong process. It's often shared by survivors that recovery is more of a process of maintenance. So my question today is, what does resilience look like when trauma is ongoing? Another important thing to note before we begin is that we at Synapse fully believe that resilience should not occur in isolation. Resilience building to us is the responsibility of the community surrounding folks who have experienced injury or trauma. This means both the familiar and the medical communities surrounding a survivor. It is all of our responsibility to make sure that when somebody is hurt, they can access the tools needed to find healing and recovery. On that note, we have brought a range of professionals who work with folks with brain injury in varying roles that are crucial for tapping into the support needed to build resilience for a survivor, as well as one professional who will share his personal experience with recovering from a brain injury. Each panelist will share their definition of resilience, as well as their work with the brain injury community, and further, the knowledge and research they have available to encourage resilience further. To begin, we have David Kracke here with us today from our very own Center for Brain Injury Research and Training. He is Oregon's Brain Injury Advocate Coordinator and is responsible for advocating for many of the policies that have been put in place in Oregon to protect brain injury survivors. David?
Anastasia, thank you so much for that introduction and for the opportunity to be part of such a distinguished panel today. It's a real honor for me. I really appreciate the work that you and Synapse have done to promote the idea of resilience for people with brain injury. The portion that I'm going to be discussing today concerns advocacy, as you mentioned, and brain injury advocacy comes in many shapes and sizes, and I'm going to really focus on a few of them today. If we can start now, please bring up the slides. To start, I wanted to break this down into kind of the three areas that I'll be talking about here in my 12 minutes or so that I'll be speaking. Number one, the concept of advocates. Who are your advocates? This blends really nicely into the one success story that I'm going to focus on, and that's the success story of Jenna Sneva, and Jenna's story that resulted in a statewide law back in 2013. I'll be digging into Jenna's story significantly, and then that's a perfect dovetail kind of into the policy and big picture. And that's really where I come from, is that idea of policy and big picture. But before I get into the meat of that, I decided to really take a hard look at the actual definition of resilience. I went to two sources with this. The first source being the Oxford Dictionary. And as you can see, Oxford has two definitions. The first, resilience, is the capacity to recover quickly from difficulties and toughness. And I thought, first of all, when I read that, it was like, okay, doesn't that encapsulate exactly what brain injury survivors are dealing with? Doesn't that exactly encapsulate that attitude that those survivors bring with them in order to really maximize their recovery? Difficulties, I think obviously that word is way too soft for the life circumstance that you find yourself in. Toughness, however, is perfect. That's what it requires to be resilient. And in definition number two, once again, it just kind of nailed it right on the head. The ability of a substance or object to spring back into shape, and elasticity. And the word elasticity, we've all heard of neuroplasticity, the brain being an elastic organ, the brain being able to rewire itself, where it used to go from A to B, now it goes from A to C to D to E to F to B. That whole idea of elasticity, I just love the fact that that was in the definition. So next I went to MERRIAM-WEBSTER, our old friend from every grade school we ever were at. And MERRIAM-WEBSTER defines resilience as the capability of a strained body to recover its size and shape after deformation caused especially by compressive stress. And I just thought to myself, it may not be compressive stress, but my goodness, it is certainly stress. And are you as the brain injury survivor capable of recovering that size and shape, and whatever, let's think of that metaphorically, whatever that really means in your life. Then number two, an ability to recover from or adjust easily to misfortune or change. And I certainly think you can just relate to that on its face. So now I'm going to tell a little bit about my own story. And in a way, as I was thinking about this slide, I don't want to dwell on it too much, but I do want to let you guys know who I am. My current position is Oregon's Brain Injury Advocate Coordinator. This is a position that was created as the result of the Governor's Task Force on Traumatic Brain Injury. Began our work in 2013, ended our work in 2018 with 8 policy recommendations, one of which was to create the position of Brain Injury Advocate Coordinator for the state. And I was so honored when the folks at CBERT and ultimately through the governor's office asked me to commit to being that person if we were able to get this grant. Prior to that, I was in legal advocacy. I've been an attorney since 1990. From the start, I was representing individuals with brain injury in all sorts of either personal injury claims, insurance claims, work comp, various benefits. Right there, that gave me just such a very intimate window into the life of brain injury survivors and their loved ones. I was the guy that I was on my side of the desk listening to these stories day after day after day. It was really an opportunity to figure out what that meant. I also, as a result, did conservatorships and guardianships. Many of you understand those processes intimately. And of course, I did it all through trials, arbitrations, mediations, settlement, and claim resolution of pretty much all kinds. That led into, it gave me the tools to begin this policy work that's on the right-hand column. And I'm not going to get into it with real detail here, but it started with an uninsured motorist claim, a carjacking client, a client who got injured carjacking and found out that the statute needed to be changed. It took 2 sessions, that's my own resilience, to get that done. That led to Max's Law. I was on the team. I was on the board of the Brain Injury Alliance of Oregon at the time. And Max's Law was the nation's first enacted youth concussion law. My parallel passion is endangered species protection. So I was on a team that did the shark fin ban in 2011. Then Jenna's Law, which we're going to talk about, an anti-poaching law that I wrote in 2017. And then finally, last session, academic accommodations after a brain injury for students who will not need a 504 plan or an individualized education program, an IEP, but they do need academic accommodations during that recovery period in the normal recovery range of anywhere from 3 to 4 to 6 to 8 to 12 weeks before a 504 plan would become necessary. It was one of 3 bills that became law last session before the walkout that occurred down there out of 273 that were submitted. So very, very proud of that work. And I hope that gives you an idea about the resilience in my own life, how this has been a lot of work for me over the years, and something that I'm obviously very passionate about, both of which are key to resilience, the passion as well as the understanding and the willingness to work for it. This next slide is, I'm just going to kind of skip through it pretty quick. I wanted to emphasize again MERRIAM-Webster's misfortune or change, and just to say, look, if it were only that simple, if the situation that you find yourself in were just a matter of buying something new or painting something or painting a wall or whatever it might be, that's not the change or the misfortune that we're talking about here. We're talking about stuff that is misfortune and change. It really can be really to the core of who you are, and really I think require you to find that resilience, that internal strength, because this is such an important topic. Injuries, as we know, require healing. Healing takes many forms. Of course, there is self-healing, so critical to keep that drive for self-healing going. And of course, also in this environment, help from others. So I focused a bit on who your advocates might be. And your advocates certainly are yourself, your loved ones, and for all the caregivers on this call, on this webinar, thank you, thank you, thank you. The medical providers, therapists, counselors, you're going to hear from some today or tonight. Support groups and peer groups, critically important. Educators, other professionals such as attorneys. I can address this idea of advocate from my perspective. And from my perspective, I was the guy that kept all those insurance people at bay. I would literally tell my clients, I would say, when I represent you, I am the castle wall. I am the advocate that's going to provide a defense between you and all of those people that want to know a statement. They want to know about insurance information. They want to prove that it wasn't, the other guy's fault, that it was your fault. They want to subject you to all sorts of examinations. I know you know what I'm talking about. I was the guy that said, it's my job as your advocate to be that strength, to be that castle wall. This is what I did. This is what advocates do in their various roles. This essentially is when the I becomes the we. I want to take a second and introduce you to Jenna Sneva. This picture is from 2013. From left to right, we have Senator Tim Knopp, one of the sponsoring legislators. That's myself. Then Jenna Sneva is next to me. Governor Kitzhaber is seated, of course. That's Senator Elizabeth Steiner Hayward. That's Dr. Jim Chestnut. And then Rhonda Sneva, Jenna Sneva's mom, to the far right. Jenna was a snowboarder. She did skier cross. She had 11 concussions before she finally got to Dr. Chestnut. Jim Chestnut and I were working on this new law that was going to expand concussion prohibitions, concussion protocol throughout all youth sports in the state, but we needed a face. We needed someone to be the face of that law. I had a meeting with Jenna and with Rhonda in my office, and I went through this with them, and Jenna agreed to do this. She was just ultimate trooper with regard to just the stress that I was putting her under, asking her to do this, but she was solid, rock solid in front of me. I found out 3 years later, she told me that after that meeting, she went home to Sisters and basically holed up in a room for 2 days. She couldn't do a thing. She was so exhausted after that meeting that I took for granted. She, on the other hand, mustered all of her strength to say yes to being the face to that law. That was resilience in the process. I'm going kind of running out of time here, unfortunately, but Jenna's law very quickly prevents second impact syndrome, with somewhat of a disputed diagnosis now, but basically prevents the cascading neurological effect that happens when you get concussed while still suffering from one concussion. establishes the protocols for coaches to recognize a concussion may have happened, remove the player, refer the player to a doctor, and only let that player return with a note from that qualified healthcare professional. It provided mandatory education for everyone basically on that field, from players over the age of 12 to parents, coaches, and referees. Just became a huge educational tool for the state of Oregon. The resilience tools that I've outlined and that I hope you'll keep in mind, I know this is very brief. Hope and determination, really important, kind of your umbrella motivations. Recognition of your team, understand you are not out there alone. You have people that care about you and are working for you. Do your best to find those resources. I am a huge proponent of showing gratitude, of finding the good within whatever situation it might be. I'm also a huge proponent of facing the bad with resolve, with effort to overcome it, understanding that you're going to take small, steady steps before you ever run. Recognize the journey and find the strength in your story. So I'm going to close with a quote, somewhat of a mangled quote. It was a haiku in its original form. It's from a Japanese 17th century Japanese poet, samurai, physician named Mizuta Masahide. My barn having burned down, now I can see the moon. And that gives you the idea of what we're talking about. The barn, the roof of that barn was everything that you thought was protecting you. It's burned down, it's no longer there, that protection is gone, but guess what? You look up and you can see the moon. You can see the light at the end of that tunnel. You can see a goal to work towards. So thank you very much. I really appreciate this opportunity. And last slide, please, Anastasia. And finally, I will throw it out there that if anyone out there has any questions, that's what I'm here for. Happy to talk to anybody. Just contact me with your thoughts, questions, or concerns. Thank you so much.
Thank you, David. Next, we have a collaborative discussion from two members of our very own Head Code Clinic. Dr. Linville is a faculty member of the College in Education and has received specialized training in medical family therapy through her doctoral fellowship at the University of Chicago, and has extensive experience providing therapy for individuals, couples, families, and groups dealing with acute and chronic illness, disabilities, and loss. With her today is Aaron Rothbart, who is a doctoral student in the Communication Disorders and Sciences program in the College of Education. He is here to share with us a little bit about resilience, including the resilience of the brain itself, as well as a glimpse of his dissertation research, which pertains to resilience and brain injury recovery. All right, Aaron and Deanna, take it away.
Thank you so much. I wanted to start off by talking about why, as professionals in the rehabilitation process, why are Deanna and I here to speak with you? So, Deanna, I don't know if you wanted to kind of introduce your role in recovery and rehabilitation briefly, and then I'll do the same.
Sure. So I see my role as, primarily a support for the family, including the individual that is in recovery from a traumatic brain injury, and helping that family to work together to form that team of we that Dave was talking about, and to be able to acknowledge, I think, some of the losses that come along, but also the hope and resilience that they can find as they establish their new normal.
And then I've worked as a rehab professional since 2006 and specializing in rehabilitation with adults that have sustained acquired brain injuries. And up until that point, I really focused on cognitive rehabilitation with those individuals until transitioning out here to obtain my PhD, which is really focused on resiliency and clinical engagement. How do us as clinicians, as therapists, as medical professionals engage the populations in ways that either enhance resiliency among individuals or hinder it based on our own behaviors? So this is truly a passion area for myself, and I'm excited to share it with you. As Dave was saying, this is a big topic. We don't have much time to delve too much into it, but there's a reason why we all have different definitions of resilience. There's a lot of words that kind of reference how people see resiliency. And so here are just some words that I pulled that I've heard in reference to resilience, especially words like hardiness, bounce back ability, adaptability. and Dave provided some of his own. But one of the things is that there's no uniform definition of resilience. There's a definition through dictionaries, but actually in the literature, there's not a uniform definition. So for the sake of this presentation, I'm going to open up that definition because these are really the outcomes. What happens is when you demonstrate resilience, you show hardiness, you show strength. So we want to talk a little bit about the underlying why, the underlying how do people engage in resilient behaviors. So for the sake of that, we're going to create a working definition for today, and that is a complex and multifaceted construct that enables individuals to adjust and cope when faced with adversity. So I'm broadening the definition because resilience is complex. So I wanted to just give a brief history of resilience as it's identified throughout the literature, just because it's interesting and it describes why it is so complex. So resiliency was first researched in the 1960s by researchers working with schizophrenic patients. And so they were looking at individuals that had schizophrenic episodes and looking at their outcomes. And through that, they determined that resilience was a trait, an innate trait in individuals. So people were either born with resilience or they were not. Eventually, the child development field took up resiliency, and it first started with that idea that resilience must be an innate trait in individuals. But they noticed in looking at disadvantaged youths over time that there was fluctuations in resiliency. And so they determined that resilience is actually a process. It varies over time. Well, eventually, the positive psychology movement took over resiliency research, and they started to look at that fluctuation and also the things that influence resilience in that process of resilience, and they actually identified that resilience can also serve as an outcome. So what that means is that there are things that you can do to build resiliency. And so as a researcher looking at brain injury populations in particular, I wanted to demonstrate for you some of the literature ingredients that have been found that help to support resiliency. So I've got kind of a big list here, but I wanted to walk through them briefly just to show that these are some of the things that have been found to be essential to establishing resiliency. Not that an individual needs all of these things, but it gives you an idea of the scope of what's necessary in order to establish resilience. So being able to demonstrate emotional stability and not be taken away by your emotions so that you're able to be in control, maintaining positive outlooks and optimism is one of the critical skills in being resilient. One of the ways of doing these skills is by demonstrating self-regulation, having control over yourself in any given instance, having a strong social perception, how you engage with others and how others engage with you. A critical skill is insightful modification of your behavior, so you're able to identify how your behavior influences those around you. Demonstrating good problem-solving skills. As we're learning, relationships are everything. I'm a licensed speech pathologist. I obviously value relationships and communication very much so, but it is really critical to being able to express your wants, needs, and desires to those around you. Engaging in self-care activities, so not just focusing on the rehabilitative process, but engaging in things that are rejuvenative to you. Now, there is some research that shows that heritable traits do influence resilience, basically setting up that some individuals are more prone to resilience compared with others based on some heritable traits, such as an even temperament. One of the cruxes of resilience, though, is your belief system. And it's not a belief system within a spiritual realm, but it's a belief system within yourself. Your ability to succeed, your ability to set goals and achieve those goals, and that's called self-efficacy. Looking at external and environmental factors, I would say this is where a lot of my research is looking at, is how do outside individuals influence your ability to tap into your own resiliency. Some things that are foundational that may affect resilience are your pre-adversity functioning, so how you were prior to when you sustained your injury, but also looking at how adaptive were you at that point prior to your injury. Were you able to adapt to trauma successfully, or did you struggle through that process? May be influential on how you demonstrate resilience after a brain injury. And finally, positive reappraisal. That means being able to be reflective, go back and look at things and finding the positive. So these are just some key ingredients that have been identified throughout the literature. It's not everything that's essential, and it's really specific to brain injury. So one thing I do want to note is that there are some unique challenges for individuals with brain injury to engage in those practices. So one of the first things is that change can result in anxiety and depression, and we see increased rates of that among brain injury individuals, and that can hinder some of those things like positive outlooks and optimism. A lot of times, because we have changes in our ability to inhibit behaviors and emotionality, we see demonstrations of increased irritability or aggressive behaviors among individuals who've sustained injuries. There's frequently changes in communication styles and changes in being able to tolerate certain circumstances, so there's difficulty and discomfort with engaging in social situations. A lot of this is impacted by poor self-awareness, so we're not able to step outside of ourselves and analyze how we are engaging with the world around us or how we're perceiving our own behaviors within interactions and engagement. Impaired executive functioning is where we really house those mechanisms where we're able to self-monitor, but also do things like maintain organization, motivation, and engagement with the world around us. Then another impactful thing could be compromised and diminished communication skills, because it's really important to be able to express and engage with those support systems necessary to enhance your resiliency. And this is a huge one that doesn't get a lot of focus, and I think it's really critical, is a survivor's focus on the deficits that have succumbed to after the injury, and also comparison with their pre-injury functioning. So looking at how things have shifted and focusing so much on that it anchors you in place so you can't move from a place of acceptance in order to engage and move forward, which is really critical to resilience. And finally, there's frequently cognitive deficits with brain injuries, and actually all of these tie into cognitive deficits, but there can even be some related to attention and memory. So the good news is this is on the radar of researchers. It's becoming more prevalent. There's more research out there. And in fact, there's programs being developed to establish resilience among specifically brain injury populations. So I wanted to introduce you to one that's helping to guide my own research, and this is called the Resilience and Adjustment Intervention. And this is by some researchers at the Virginia Commonwealth University, and they have a program. Now, this is not something that I would be able to administer. It's done by psychologists and counselors, but I want to introduce you to the components because it really references back to that list of key ingredients towards being able to establish resiliency. And these are the factors that I'm looking at in the engagement practices of medical professionals to see if they're able to translate into how people engage in their recovery and their outcomes. So I wanted to walk you through some of these. So the first one is understanding the effects of brain injury. I am a true believer that knowledge is power, so understanding the underlying why. Why do you experience the deficits that you experience can be very empowering and result in people having greater senses of self-efficacy. Being able to have active engagement in the recovery, being able to accept that the injury has occurred, that changes have occurred, but then engaging in hope that recovery can also occur. This is a critical goal setting is very essential. So setting reasonable goals, looking at your engagement in recovery with a realistic view and lens so that you're able to set realistic goals with your practitioners and for yourself as a person. As I had mentioned earlier, problem solving effectively, so really being able to identify and develop solutions to problems as they arise and how you manage yourself as you work towards those solutions. Part of the things that get in the way are managing the emotionality that can come and changes in our ability to control our emotionality. So part of this protocol is managing stress, anger, and intense emotions. Communicating effectively, being able to get your needs met and doing it in a way where people are on your team versus working against you. So utilizing communication to develop that support system. Rebuilding relationships. Relationships are everything. We can't do these things in isolation. We really need that support system. So identifying ways of rebuilding those. And then maintaining overall a positive outlook on recovery and life in general. So these are some of the keys that that program really focuses on and that I'm looking at building into my own research. And so I'm going to now hand it over to Deanna because she's going to talk about how especially the relational factors influence the recovery process and how critical those are and why they're a focus of our talk today.
Thank you. Yeah, so I am going to be covering just some ideas around how brain injury is really should be seen through a biopsychosocial spiritual lens or model, in that it has biological, psychological, spiritual, and social impacts. A lot of the effects that Erin just covered, I think, could be in any of those domains. And so it's important to not make it more complicated, but to see not only the individual who has suffered from the brain injury as a system, but also the people around them that are supports or maybe getting in the way of recovery as also part of their system. And with this, you can really see themes from families down through the generations of how they have built resilience in dealing with other chronic conditions, illnesses, how they navigate loss, what are their stories as a family around those different aspects of life. And this model also provides a way of thinking that promotes control and empowerment. So what Erin was talking about with self-efficacy, I see also that way as agency. So what empowers the individual as well as the support people to feel like they have a sense of control and are feeling empowered to be able to take actions towards recovery. Next slide. And so with this way of viewing traumatic brain injuries, we can think about, okay, what type of illness or disability is traumatic brain injury? What are some invisible and maybe visible losses that the person is experiencing over time? Sometimes those end up being permanent losses, and other times they end up being temporary losses. And then how does that intersect with the individual and the family's development or life cycle stage? So, you know, some of the examples that Dave was talking about has to do with youth that are, you know, experience traumatic brain injury. That's going to have a particular impact on that system because of the age and because of the tasks that are associated with that life cycle stage for the family. And then as well as belief systems and sociocultural influences. So can be things like how collectivist is the society, how much do they naturally already have that sense of we and working together. It can be things like how much control we think we have over our health or our bodies. Those things can impact how someone navigates recovery from a brain injury. Next slide, please. As a family therapist, I think about how any chronic condition is not just happening to the individual, it's happening to the family. And when I say family, I define that loosely. So it can be family of choice, close friends, whoever is in that support network for the individual that has suffered the brain injury. They are going through the recovery process along with the individual. And so it creates chronic, it creates ongoing and intense relationships with the medical community, whether that be that, you know, a support or a caregiver is attending the medical appointments, or they're the ones that are trying to help follow through with the treatment plan. They are interacting with medical professionals along with the individual. And with this model, I really do think of, sick is maybe not the right word, but I really do think of the family as experiencing aspects of the injury and also aspects of the recovery. And emotional adjustment is necessary for everyone involved. And the communication and problem solving abilities and skill development also becomes necessary for everyone involved. Next slide. Some of the factors that can influence adaptation, which when I'm thinking about resiliency, I think it was alluded to by Erin and Dave, is that it's not necessarily returning to the pre-injury typical or normal functioning. It's about finding those protective factors, finding those sources of strength and hope that allow you to create that new normal and feel empowered in that new normal. And so some of the factors that can influence that is a family's instrumental style, which means kind of how do they get things done? How organized are they? How organized are they around the brain injury? What other things are maybe happening in their life that can make it more chaotic, harder for them to mobilize? Another factor is just the emotionality of the family. So Erin talked about the individual, but also how does the family or the support people, how do they emotionally regulate, and how do they respond to the emotions of the individual that suffered the brain injury? And then again, life cycle stage and development for both the individual and the family, the values of the family. Is the family really focused on in kind of a rigid way? We're gonna pick ourselves up by our bootstraps and just keep going and move on, and we're not going to acknowledge the difficulties that someone is experiencing. That can be a challenge towards resiliency, because then people are maybe feeling invalidated or feeling like something's wrong with them, that they haven't bounced back quick enough. Instead, if a family were to focus on promoting a value of a sense of we, that we're in this together, we're experiencing this together, we can acknowledge each other's kind of pain that might be associated with recovery, and also acknowledge each other's strengths and really kind of join forces. That value can really help foster resiliency in the family. And then, like I mentioned earlier, just the transgenerational history with illness and loss, not necessarily with brain injury, although if people across the generations have suffered with brain injury, I think, like Dave talked about, the laws have changed a lot, policies have changed a lot. And so if someone didn't maybe have things available to them when they were going through their recovery, and now their loved one is having those things available, that can set up just a need for conversations about that, about how things have changed over time. Next slide. And then for the individual also is, for the illness or itself, or the condition, brain injury in this case, the type of brain injury, the severity of the brain injury, whether or not it has, the person has started to recover and gain back functioning, versus maybe they've had a more significant impact to their functioning. All of those things and how someone deals with it or their family deals with it is going to impact their resiliency and their sense of their new story of their new normal. Next slide. So the basic gist of all of this is that if I'm working with a family, or if you all are within a family, a caregiving or support person, or a person yourself that is recovering from a brain injury, how can a family or those relationships and the individual increase their sense of agency? And that is a sense of making personal choices in dealing with the brain injury and recovery in the healthcare system. So not remaining passive, and sometimes that is the way that a family member can be an advocate, is by being the voice if the individual is not finding the strength to have that voice, or is feeling like they're being disregarded, then a family member can step in and help increase the voice of the individual as well as the family. And then also a sense of communion. And so that really is that sense of we, that everyone in the system feels cared for and acknowledged, that the people that are caregiving and watching their loved one go through the brain injury and recovery process are also experiencing their emotions and feeling like they are cared about as well. And that there's that mutual support that is being shared and received across the family. And the basic premise of medical family therapy and the biopsychosocial spiritual model is that oftentimes in medicine, there's really an individual focus, a disease focus, and there's not a lot of information or as much information about how do people deal with the psychosocial challenges and navigate those challenges in such a way that they can find meaning and create new stories and find their resiliency and autonomy. So the key task is maintaining autonomy within the constraints of the brain injury and recovery. Okay, I think that's it for my slides. Nope, not. I think I'm out of time though, so I'm gonna, if you wanna skip ahead, Aaron.
Okay. So one thing we did just want to really quickly conclude on is the idea of the brain's ability to demonstrate resilience, which is what Dave mentioned earlier, which is neuroplasticity. And it's really defined as the brain's ability to form and reorganize synaptic connections. And this is in response to learning, experience, or stimulation, but it's also what a lot of people rely on after brain injury. This is a little bit of a controversial topic, and we're not going to have a lot of time to go into it, but I did want to touch on how it's associated with brain injury. And it's really that idea of the brain's ability to rewire functions. Dave gave a really great example of getting from point A to point B. That synaptic connection is no longer intact. Therefore, the brain has to reroute in order to get to the B point. And so it's retraining the brain to be able to do that. Another thing that can occur due to neuroplasticity is loss of function in one area of the brain may enhance function in another. A lot of the things that are impacted by brain injury are sensory processing. So people might say, oh, I've got a better sense of hearing. And it's not so much that your sense of hearing actually improved, but it's that some of the other senses are dulled. So you're more attuned to the sense of hearing. Therefore, it appears that it has actually increased. But what we want to do in rehabilitation is really train the brain. We want to challenge it and use repetition to get those rewired networks to actually be online and to habituate that process. So really from a neurological perspective and from a rehabilitative perspective, that's kind of our aim. It's really that repetition and challenge that we're pushing the brain to recognize function and to reorganize how it executes that. And that is what we're going to conclude on for right now.
All right, thank you both so much. Next, we have Ben Luskin, who is a licensed professional counselor. He has served 6 years on the State Independent Living Council, during which he participated in disability advocacy and educational efforts around the country. He has also co-founded and co-leads a disability rights activist chapter called ADAPT in Oregon, and he has also published a recovery manual based on his own experience recovering from a severe traumatic brain injury. I want to say that we're sharing with Ben, and we're talking face to face now. So if everybody wants to put speaker view on, that's your best way to engage with Ben. Thank you. Ben, take it away.
Well, gosh, thanks for the introduction, Anastasia, and it's really so great to be here. Like Anastasia said, I'm a licensed professional counselor. I'm also a certified professional coach here in Eugene, Oregon. I'm also the survivor of a traumatic brain injury. And I've just gotten to know Anastasia and the Synapse support group here recently, and I'm really beyond pleased to hear the emphasis being placed on resilience and empowerment and ownership, as these themes have been huge in my own life and really have guided so much of the work that I do. So what I'm going to do today in the time that I have, and I'm going to go real quick, I'm going to practice talking fast, is I'm going to run through my timeline, my personal story, and then I'm going to share with you what I consider the 3 most important things to consider in recovery or life in general. Okay, we ready? Here goes. September 28th, 1994, I was sitting in the back of a minivan. We got knocked into the other lane of a highway, and a semi-truck going full speed ran right into us. I had my seatbelt on, so I didn't go launching forward, but my head rocked forward so fast that my brain smashed into my skull and back again, causing what's called a coup contra coup injury. I spent 6 weeks unconscious, about 3 months in the hospital, relearning how to walk and talk, how to think, just about everything, you name it, before being released back to my home, back to life. I went through middle school, high school, college, having fun, playing around, getting in trouble like kids do, but also struggling with issues around self-acceptance, peer acceptance, as well as just fitting in between the lines. I was known for kind of off-kilter behavior, bit wild at times. So let's see, then I graduated from college and I got a job at the Portland Public Schools as a developmental disability specialist. Having been raised with a brother on the autism spectrum, I knew a lot about what I was doing, and I really struggled in the job doing what was asked of me because, frankly, I wanted to do more and I believed I knew how to do better. So that was a difficult position for me to be in. But at the same time, or during that time, I also met the mother of my children. Now, not having a lot of experience in long-term relationships up to that point, I was, really excited and just very into the relationship, and I dove in head and first. And before long, I was expecting father. I was waiting for a child, and this kind of freaked me out. I could barely take care of myself at the time, and now I was looking at taking care of a little baby as well. And it was during that time of despair that I literally stumbled into the doors of a martial arts studio. And that's probably the most impactful, significant step that I've taken in my life thus far. So martial arts was the first thing that really encouraged me to look beyond my presentations and realize that through hard work, through dedication, and in the case of martial arts, through repetition, I could learn to do whatever I wanted to learn. So that gave me some encouragement and some confidence to step out of this this job at the schools that I didn't really like, that didn't allow me to realize my potential. So I moved to Eugene with this notion of getting involved in blue collar work. It sounded great to me to go to work and get dirty and work hard and come home and that's that. So I got a job and finished carpentry and then construction and then assembly. But needless to say, none of those jobs panned out. I lost job after job, and before long found myself unemployed and depressed, just not liking life at all. I remember thinking that I wasn't good at anything, that all I had going for me was that I was a good person. So I was in that space for a while, really struggling, until community rehab. I accepted help from community rehab to find a job at Lane Community College here in Eugene, where I got a job, again, working with adults with developmental disabilities. But this time I was encouraged to pursue and build on my ideas. And so I started a number of programs and a newsletter and things like that relating to what we're talking about today. I developed a adaptive martial arts program called Unleash the Beast Primal Movement Workshop. I teach it every year at Oregon Country Fair and have toured the country teaching workshops as well. And I'll talk more about that in a second. I also started or wrote the original manuscript of the book that I'm going to share with you in a little bit here too, called Beyond the Horizon, A Guide to Recovery from Brain Injury and Other Happenings. And I couldn't be stopped, so I went and then I got my certification as a professional coach and launched my business, Launch Empowerment Mentoring, out of my garage. Literally my first client, part of what we did was sit in my garage and listen to records. It's a very healing activity, and I recommend it to all of you. So here I was, really proud. I had something to be proud of now, something that I thought I was good at. And so I just started hustling and getting my name out everywhere I could, anywhere I could. Advocacy, activism. Like I said, I traveled around and presented at different mental health and brain injury conferences. And a big part of this ascent in my life was, again, martial arts. So in Portland, I had been training in martial arts, and it was something I did. And I had discovered so many gifts and so many rewards from it, but it was something I did. I'd go and I'd hustle and I'd do it, and then I'd come home and put it off until the next time I was in the studio. While I was working at Lane Community College, I met my future instructor and was brought into the world of Sun Mudo, or the way of cleansing and refining the mind and body, which is a Korean Zen style of martial arts. And so, like I said, this was a full-on physical, mental, and spiritual immersion in the world of martial arts, a way of life. We trained hours every day. I lived on and off with my instructor. We opened up a Zendo outside of town in Oak Ridge for a little while. And a big part here that I want you to remember as I keep talking is a big part of this, and a big part of my training here was the importance of values and ethics, and how important it was for me to stay true to my values and ethics. So for the next 10 years, we're full of ups and downs, and I'll just go over a few right here. I held a number of jobs, ranging from leading support groups in an acute psychiatric ward at the hospital to designing a role for myself as a quality of life consultant for a provider agency here in town. I also spent a year in litigation in court, fighting for my right to be a father. There was, or maybe is currently, legislation in Oregon that says you can be denied parenting rights just because of a disability, not because of performance, but just because of disability. And that was cited. And my instructor also betrayed me in about as bad a way as a brother can betray a brother. So that was really difficult. Both of those events or situations really tore me apart. But during that time, I also met Kasha, my wife, my beautiful wife, who is also a brain injury survivor, who actually we were introduced because a mutual friend of ours shared my book with her, and we're now married. And I gained my master's degree in clinical mental health counseling. So that leads me to today, where I can say, through persistence and dedication to my values and ethics, I have created a safe and supportive home for my daughters and built a loving and trusting foundation for the ever-evolving relationship with my wife, valuing honesty and work ethic above all else. And by coincidence, or perhaps not, in the past year, I've earned my professional licensure as a counselor, built a full counseling practice at Lane Independent Living Alliance, LILA, accepted the position as behavioral health specialist for the Eastern Oregon Center for Independent Living, EOCIL, co-founded a statewide disability rights activist chapter, developed new workshops and curriculum, which very, very much aligned with all this work going on with resilience that other presenters have shared, and published my book, which I will share with you in a minute. And again, of note, these accomplishments all rest on the foundations of my values and ethics. So really, that's been my guiding light. So now we're at the part where I get to share with you what I learned. I have 3 lessons to share with you, but first I want to start with a quote from Viktor Frankl, who is an Austrian existentialist philosopher who spent time in the concentration camps during the Holocaust. He said, "Between stimulus and response, there is a space. In that space is our power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and freedom." So first lesson, know yourself, honor yourself. We must be brutally honest with ourselves and stop pointing fingers and looking for an escape from our struggle. We must use struggle as an opportunity to learn to accept and become familiar with ourselves, specifically our values and beliefs. We must engage. We must be persistent. Our challenges offer us invaluable opportunities for growth and development. Number 2, define your success. We have a choice to choose how we measure our self-worth, through process or outcome. When we choose outcome, we are letting others tell us what is important to us. We are letting others, or we are agreeing to play by their rules. But hey, the playing field's not the same. When we choose process, we can define our success according to our efforts and whether or not we believe that we are giving our personal best. Again, aligned with our values and ethics. Third lesson, allow yourself to feel defeated. Really? Aren't we working so hard to not feel like a failure? Yes and no. There's a big difference between feeling like a failure and being a failure. Feelings are fleeting, coming in and then going out. Conversely, to be a failure is to admit your lack of self-worth. So when you feel like a failure, my advice is to go with it. See where it brings you, knowing that wherever you end up is only temporary. So those are the 3 lessons that I have for you. And if you hold on to them, they will bring you far. I want to close with a poem. I like how Dave closed with a little haiku excerpt from a Japanese samurai. So I'm going to share with you a poem that I wrote. I swim underwater and paint stripes on zebras, all the while listening to a right pair of speakers. For me, it's easy to find the place where anything can happen, like a soldier finagling his way to more rations. But the place where I struggle, and perhaps you can help me out, is when the goblins in the forest drown out my whispers with shouts. They say it's their turn to speak. They demand to be heard too. But when I pass them the talking stick, I'm weary of losing my truth. All those lessons I learned while down under, over the top and off on a bender, become like visions on a pale desert landscape, which, though pleasing to contemplate, dry up at the touch like a Paleolithic lake. So where does that leave me, one weary traveler, with bruises on my knees and holes in my trousers, and a limp on one side from a long-forgotten injury, and a collection of shrapnel meticulously extracted with tweezers? If you know, I beseech you, tell me so, because I've been struggling since the day after tomorrow. So, you know, that says it. That says just how important it is to listen to those whispers, how important it is to stay true to yourself, to your core self, to how you understand yourself and who you are. So I want to share with you, here's my book. It's called, it looks upside down in the screen, but it's called Beyond the Horizon, A Guide to Recovery from Brain Injury and Other Happenings. This is the very book that I started writing 20 years ago. It is filled with so many of the notions and concepts now associated with the resiliency field, which I really didn't know anything about until, an hour ago. You can order it on Amazon. It's again, Beyond the Horizon, A Guide to Recovery from Brain Injury and Other Happenings. And what I want to tell you is it costs $12, but if you buy it and talk to me, get a hold of me and talk to me about how these themes show up in your life, I'll pay you back. And if you send it to me, I'll even pay for postage. So really all you got to do is reach out. So that's what I have for you. It's really been an honor to share. It's been just great to hear about this field of resiliency, like I said, which I knew very little about, and to hear that science and medicine are really coming up. Actually, on that note, because I'm rambling now, I will say that I've spent these past few weeks while we've all been stuck at home, tuned into several summits online. And the last one was called the Parasympathetic Summit. And it talked about, Stephen Porges theory, things we're learning about the vagus nerve, which connects our brain with our different organs, as well as our sympathetic, our nervous system, our autonomic nervous system, and really how much our thoughts and our intentions really can affect our health on a cellular level. So I'm so excited with the converging of all these different branches of study in our world, and you know, this webinar right here, we're like standing on the cutting edge. So I love it. I'm so happy to be here. Thanks for having me, and
Thank you, Ben.
goodbye.
I just have to say, first and foremost, if that doesn't inspire and encourage resilience, I don't know what does. Thank you for sharing so much. That was wonderful. I know we're going a little bit over, but I did want to open up the room for any questions. If you have them, please just put them in the chat box and I can read them aloud to everybody who is on our panel. So if anybody has a question, please just put that in the chat box now and we'll give a minute in case anybody does, okay? Let's see, we got, what is everyone's contact? I put Ben's website in the chat box, so if anybody wants that information, you can click on that link above. I don't know if Dave, Deanna, and Aaron, if you feel comfortable sharing whatever, you're welcome to. But
Anastasia, this is Dave. I'm absolutely happy to share my contact information. It was on that last slide, but you want me to give out my email? Sure.
if you're comfortable with it, you're welcome to.
Absolutely. It's my first initial, D, and then my last name, Kracke, with a K, Kracke. It's up there on my video identifier. And that is at Cbirt, CBIRT.org.
All right, and we do have one question. Is there research about how some of those protective factors that Deanna listed in the second presentation actually physically affecting neuroplasticity? So again, do these protective factors physically change neuroplasticity?
I actually think that's for Aaron. I think that was the slide that had all the arrows with the squares.
All right. Aaron, hot seat.
Yeah, not a problem. Yeah, so the way that it actually, the brain is a powerful thing. One of the practices that I really embed in my own clinical practice, and as well as teaching the students that I work with in the speech pathology department here at the university, is mindfulness practices. And we know just engaging in those actually changes the physiological components of the brain, including shrinking like the amygdala, which is kind of the base of our fight or flight response to stimuli. And so it really does have an impact on affecting the physical neuroplasticity. So not just your physical ability to execute certain skills, but also your neurological ability. But it's not so much as just, you're basically retraining your brain. So it's really about those two factors that I mentioned, which are, it has to be challenging. If something's not challenging your brain, it's reinforcing the same synaptic connection that it already has in play. We want to challenge it to form new synaptic connections. So it's really, it has to be challenging in order to engage the neurological functions. And then it also takes repetition. Think about, they say it takes 2 weeks to build a habit. So we need to reinforce it with repetition of skills in order to really develop and lock it in as a neurological pathway. I'm not sure, hopefully I answered that clearly, but
Awesome, fantastic. Thank you, Erin. If anybody wants any clarification, feel free to add in the chat box. I do have a really, I think, very apt and important question from Nancy that asks, where does one begin in seeking support for recovery? Are advocates available? I'm going to start by saying I think peers are very important. Obviously, that's my opinion since I'm part of Synapse and we host a peer support group. I think peers are a great first starting stone, but I don't know, Ben, do you want to maybe address this question?
Okay. Phew. So like I was talking to the other presenters before the webinar began, my brain injury was in '94. So there was a very different set of options out there. But what I can say is just following one step after another. You find one lead and you work with that lead and you figure out what works for you and what doesn't work for you, and ask questions, and just keep moving forward, keep trying new things and considering what is it teaching you about yourself, what are you learning. I'd say our greatest teacher in brain injury recovery is ourselves and our awareness. What other people can do is share tools, share concepts, provide structure, but really what it comes down to is we're in charge. We own our recovery. But yeah, you got to start with one step and keep going.
And I also want to emphasize, though, that there typically a lot of communities, especially larger communities, will have supports in place. Because does Lila provide support services for individuals and advocates? I feel like I've worked with some individuals that have referenced.
Yeah, well, thank you. Lila, Lane Independent Living Alliance, is what's called a Center for Independent Living. And they cater to all individuals that identify with disabilities. And what they have there is what's called independent living specialists that can help people find different resources, kind of like a brokerage, help them find different resources. There's various services there. Some people find more success there than others. Yeah, there's no perfect answer, but Lila certainly has some options, as do other so organizations around.
And one of those organizations I would actually say is the university itself. So at the university, I supervise in a head co-clinic on campus at the College of Education, and we have a brain injury clinic. I just saw somebody post about that. They said that they couldn't help you. Well, one of the things is that clinic is constantly evolving and changing, and one of the things that we offer now, and it's free to the public, is a brain injury education and support group on Fridays from 10:30 to 12:30, currently for the remainder of this term, which is only another week or so. But then we'll be picking back up in the winter term in January on Fridays from 10 to 12. And that's open to the public. It's a support group. The individuals are led by students. I supervise that group. We also have a caregiver support group that is done in collaboration with the Couples and Family Therapy department, and that's on Tuesdays from 12 to 1. So we actually have a lot of resources that are starting to develop for the local community here in Lane County, just through the university, to fill in some of those gaps that we've recognized that are either not in place or have unfortunately dissipated because of the COVID restrictions and financial strain. But please reach out to me if you have any questions about those groups. Again, they're open to anybody and they are completely free. We got some really great students that are leading those.
Yeah, and I think it was important what Ben said, where, everyone has a different route, right? What works for one person doesn't work for everybody, and that just goes across so much of recovery. It's encouraging to hear that Synapse is a good resource for you, Nancy. And I also just want to share, there's so many avenues. Just keep reaching out. We're available, and if anybody wants to reach us, again, just shoot out an email. Ben, did you want to add something to that?
Yeah, thanks. I also want to say that I am available. I have a private practice here in town. It's actually in the Lila building. And I'm happy to, work in a more intensive clinical context with folk. But I also invite people, if they have questions or just want to start an informal dialogue, I'm also happy to offer my perspective, my thoughts, my feedback to you all.
We have another question. Do any of you have any knowledge on possible research intern positions available through the university for undergrads? I'm going to start by saying at Synapse, we're always looking for folks as well. If you want to engage on a kind of more grassroots advocacy and awareness level, you're welcome to reach out to us. But Erin, do you want to answer that one further?
Right now, because of COVID restrictions, it's a little challenging with regard to undergraduates involving themselves in research. I don't even think in at least the speech pathology department that they're offering the course number that would allow for that. Right now they're just working with the graduate students, but hopefully that will change. My own research, I certainly could use assistance and help in, but our hands are a little tied at the moment, but hopefully that will be opening back up. And please grab my email address from the chat and then reach out to me, and I will email you as soon as I have further information and the go-ahead to do that.
Awesome. With that, I'm going to close the evening. Thank you all for coming. It's been really encouraging, and I think we're getting a lot of gratitude, and I have a lot of gratitude for everybody who's here and everyone who came. So with that, thank you.